Japanese admirals watched their secret weapon fail. Young pilots flew into battle, but something went terribly wrong. The missions weren't working as planned. Admirals started doubting their own strategy. One commander saw the truth no one wanted to admit. He said something that changed everything. What he revealed in his final report would expose the reality behind the missions, and the words he used still haunt historians today. The desperate strategy. By late 1944, Japan was losing the war. Their navy was running out of ships. Experienced pilots were gone. So military leaders came up with a desperate plan. They called it the Special Attack Units. The world would know them as Kamikaze. The idea was simple but shocking. Young pilots would fly planes loaded with explosives. They would crash directly into American warships. One plane, one ship, one mission. Admiral Takejiro Onishi presented this strategy to his commanders. He believed it was Japan's only chance. Traditional attacks weren't working anymore. The admirals approved the plan quickly. They thought it would turn the tide of battle. They expected massive destruction of enemy forces. But within weeks of the first missions, something unexpected started happening. The results weren't matching up with the predictions at all, and the admirals began to notice troubling patterns. The first missions begin. October 1944 marked the first official kamikaze operations. Young pilots volunteered for the missions. Some were barely 20 years old. They received minimal training compared to regular pilots, just enough to take off and find a target. Landing skills didn't matter anymore. The first group launched from Philippine air bases. Admirals watched from command centers with high expectations. They waited for reports of American carriers sinking. Initial reports sounded promising. Several pilots reportedly hit their targets. American ships were said to be heavily damaged. But as more detailed information came back, the reality looked very different from the claims. Intelligence officers started comparing Japanese reports with American radio traffic. The numbers didn't match up at all. Ships that were supposedly destroyed were still operating days later. And that's when senior admirals started asking difficult questions. Questions that nobody wanted to answer. The shocking truth emerges. Admiral Matome Ugaki kept detailed personal records. He commanded many kamikaze operations from his headquarters. His private writings tell a very different story. Within the first month, he noticed something alarming. Pilots were missing their targets completely, not by a little bit, but by hundreds of meters. American ships had powerful defensive systems. They spotted incoming planes from far away. They fired massive amounts of anti-aircraft rounds. Many young pilots panicked when they saw the walls of fire. They changed course at the last second, or they crashed into the ocean before reaching any ship. Ugaki wrote in his diary with clear frustration. He said the failure rate was unacceptably high. Resources were being wasted with little result. But here's what troubled him most. Even when pilots did hit their targets, the damage was often minimal. American carriers had thick armor plating. Small planes couldn't penetrate their defenses effectively. The Admiral's private doubts. Admiral Ugaki wasn't alone in his concerns. Other senior commanders started voicing similar observations, but they had to be careful about speaking publicly. Questioning the kamikaze strategy was considered disloyal. The missions had become a symbol of Japanese fighting spirit. Criticizing them could end a military career instantly. So admirals discussed their doubts only in private meetings, or they wrote carefully worded reports, using technical language to hide their real concerns. One admiral described the situation as operationally inefficient. That was military code for saying it wasn't working. Another called for strategic reassessment of resource allocation. They knew the truth but couldn't say it directly. Young men were giving their lives for minimal results. The strategy was failing, but nobody could stop it. Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka served as Chief of Staff. He attended planning meetings where success rates were discussed. What he heard in those closed-door sessions would never appear in official military records. The numbers don't lie. Military analysts began collecting hard data. They tracked every kamikaze mission launched. They compared claims against actual American losses. The statistics were devastating. Out of every 10 kamikaze pilots sent out, only 1 or 2 reached an American ship. And even those hits rarely sank their targets. Most caused minor damage that was quickly repaired. American damage control teams were extremely skilled. Admiral Ugaki reviewed these numbers personally. He calculated the cost versus the results. Each mission used valuable aircraft and fuel. Japan's resources were nearly exhausted by this point. Every plane that missed was a terrible waste. They couldn't afford to keep losing equipment for nothing. In one private memo, Ugaki wrote something remarkable. He said the strategy had failed to achieve expected outcomes. That simple phrase carried enormous weight. A top admiral was admitting the whole program wasn't working, but the missions continued anyway. Why admirals couldn't stop it. So why didn't the admirals cancel the kamikaze missions? If they knew it was failing, why continue? The answer reveals something important about military culture. By early 1945, the program had become symbolic. It represented Japan's willingness to fight to the end. Stopping it would signal defeat and loss of spirit. Admiral Onishi, who'd created the strategy, had enormous influence. He believed the missions served a psychological purpose, even if they didn't sink many ships. They showed Japan would never surrender. Other admirals disagreed but couldn't speak up. The military hierarchy demanded absolute loyalty. Challenging a superior officer's plan was unthinkable. Plus, propaganda had made the kamikaze pilots into heroes. The Japanese public believed they were winning great victories. Admitting the truth would destroy national morale. So the admirals stayed quiet. They sent more young pilots on missions they knew would probably fail, and privately, some of them struggled with terrible guilt. The admiral who spoke out. One admiral did try to challenge the strategy directly. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata commanded air operations. He had access to all the mission data. In March 1945, Takata submitted a detailed report.
He documented the actual success rates honestly. He included recommendations for major changes. Takata suggested using the pilots for conventional attacks instead. At least that way, they could return and fly again. Experienced pilots were more valuable than single missions. His report went up the chain of command. Senior officers read it carefully. Some agreed with his assessment privately, but officially the report was rejected. Takata was told to focus on improving tactics, not questioning strategy. He tried one more time to make his case. He met personally with Admiral Onishi. What happened in that meeting was never recorded officially. But Takata never challenged the program again. Some historians believe he was threatened to be removed from command.
The final desperate months. As 1945 continued, the situation grew worse. American forces were closing in on Japan itself. The Kamikaze program expanded dramatically. Thousands more young pilots were recruited. Training time was cut even shorter. Some pilots got only a few weeks of instruction. Admiral Ugaki watched this acceleration with growing horror. His diary entries became darker and more troubled. He wrote about pilots who could barely fly straight. They were being sent on missions anyway. The failure rate climbed even higher. More planes crashed before reaching any target. In April 1945, during the Battle of Okinawa, Japan launched over 1,500 kamikaze sorties. It was the largest concentration of these attacks in the war. American ships did take damage. Several were hit, and some sailors were lost. But the American fleet kept operating. They adjusted their defenses quickly, and Japan lost over 1,500 aircraft and pilots, resources they could never replace. What the admirals said in private. After the war ended, some admirals spoke more openly. Their statements revealed the private doubts they'd hidden. Admiral Ugaki's diary was eventually published. In it, he described the kamikaze strategy as tragic necessity. He admitted it had failed to change the war's outcome. He expressed regret about the young lives lost. Other admirals gave interviews to military historians. Admiral Kusaka said the program continued too long. He believed it should have ended by early 1945. One commander stated something even more direct. He said senior leaders knew the missions weren't effective, but stopping them was politically impossible. These admissions were difficult for many Japanese to hear. The kamikaze pilots had been honored as heroes. Learning that their commanders doubted the strategy, that they'd known the missions were mostly failing, it raised painful questions about military leadership, about whether those young lives were wasted. The legacy and the truth. Today, historians continue studying the kamikaze operations. Modern analysis confirms what the admirals privately knew. The strategy failed to achieve its military objectives. Out of approximately 4,000 kamikaze sorties, only about 15% successfully hit American ships, and most of those hits didn't sink their targets. The total cost to the U.S. Navy was significant, but not enough to change the war's direction. Japan lost thousands of aircraft and trained personnel. Admiral Ugaki himself flew the last kamikaze mission on August 15, 1945, after Japan surrendered. He took off with several young pilots. They never reached any target. Their planes disappeared over the ocean. Ugaki left behind his detailed diaries.
In his final entries, he wrote about honor and duty, but earlier pages revealed his true thoughts, the doubts, the frustration, the recognition of failure. What Japanese admirals said when they saw the kamikaze failures was written in private documents they never meant anyone to read. The Imperial Japanese Navy's views on kamikaze tactics revealed a tragic truth. Japanese admirals' reactions to kamikaze failures showed deep internal conflict. The Battle of Okinawa Kamikaze results proved their concerns were justified. Kamikaze attacks' impact on World War II was far less than expected. The consequences for Japan were devastating. WWII Kamikaze strategy analysis continues teaching us lessons today. Understanding Japanese military kamikaze opinions helps us remember war's human cost beyond the battles.